Welcome back. This is going to be our first of our kind of lecture-based review periods. So again, I posted a AP College Board AP Classroom series of review questions. So please make sure you're doing those. This will be a very brief breakdown. Period one is by far the. I'm catching myself. I almost said least essential. That's not true. But kind of the one you'll be least accountable for. So this one will be a little briefer. Period one is from 1491 to 1607. So that is a really long stretch of time, but it's also a very formative time. We mark 1491 as our beginning of period one because that's when European arrival in the Americas occurs. Of course, we know that plenty of things are happening prior to 1491 in North America, but this is a United States history test, so this is kind of the launching point. And it ends in 1607 with the establishment of Jamestown, really that kind of first permanent English colony that we'll talk much more about in period two. So this is really more about kind of first contacts between the arriving European powers and the indigenous people. Some of the concepts in this unit, what life was like in Europe, America, and Africa prior to this. It's kind of the triangle that's formed. How a collision of cultures change each group, sometimes for the best, sometimes for the worse. We'll talk about the Black Legend. Some key terms from period one: autonomy, right? Having choice in your own life. We'll talk about the Iroquois Confederacy in those terms, how Native Americans actually were not a passive group waiting to be encountered, but had their own systems, their own governments, their own treaties between other nations, definitely showing a high level of sophistication. We'll talk about the Columbian Exchange. This is that big collision of ideas and physical items and even disease that gets spread between the groups. We'll talk then about the Black Legend. Was it all negative, or was there some positive exchange? A much more detailed thing is the encomienda system, this kind of breakdown of Spanish control in really Latin American places. We'll talk about subjugation. One thing to always keep in mind is that the Native American cultures are highly diverse, and a driving factor of this diversity is always going to be geography. People adapt to where they live. The Pueblos of the Southwest will be very different than, say, the Plains Native Americans. And some an Inuit in the North will have a much different life. So we never should try and kind of paint all Native American societies with one brush. They are very diverse and very different based on their locations. Some have pretty large, like the Ohio River Valley, pretty large settlements with large gatherings of people. Others are much more nomadic. Others are much more arid. The Pueblos for Southwest is a great example of that. But as we see with colonization start to occur, there's really three big players. In the purple here, we have the French, who come mostly from the north through Canada on their way down. We have the Spanish, probably the biggest player, arriving in modern-day Mexico. And also see the British arriving on what will become the East Coast, the 13 colonies. But each of these groups has a very different kind of approach to dealing with the Americans. This is kind of pressed forward by the growing connectiveness of the world, how everyone's starting to really rely on each other. We call it the Columbian Exchange, right? And you see it here, sometimes called triangular trade. A lot of things we take for granted today as being maybe in our minds native somewhere, like potatoes in Ireland, actually aren't true at all. There's a huge exchange of physical items between these two, or not these two, these three. There's also plenty of negatives that are born out of the Columbian Exchange. A desire for forced labor in the New World. We start to see slavery get introduced through the Middle Passage. We start to see disease get factored in. Smallpox in particular, just devastating to the indigenous people of the Americas. One thing that this leaves out, though, is more maybe belief structures. Notice that you don't see anything about Catholicism, religion being brought to the New World. You don't see anything about the Spanish language being brought. So definitely some powerful ideas, not just physical items. In terms of variation in treatment, the French are really one of the more positive contributors in terms of contact. They view the Native Americans as allies, trade allies in particular. The French aren't really truly concerned with colonization in terms of settlements and moving large portions of people. It's really more of an economic endeavor, and thus it made more sense to have an economic partnership with Native Americans, and that led to a much more positive connection. On the flip side, you see the Spanish, and we notoriously have that idea of the black legend, that all they brought was pain and destruction. And you can point to Cortez, the killer there, and I mean, you can see why that happens, right? You see like Pope's rebellion that kind of forced out the Spanish, and forced them to actually start to rethink some of their treatment. And you start to see, as well on the next page, this kind of encomienda system and some assimilation occur. Now, the English, on the other hand, while we have our nice story of, first Thanksgiving, is traditionally a very combative connection with Native Americans. You can just kind of see the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, as we'll see in period 2. The English will very truly scorn the Native Americans, and that will be a mindset that truly continues throughout our course. This image here is of smallpox, one of those negative side effects of the Columbian Exchange, this almost unintended biochemical warfare that Europeans brought with them that impacted just untold amounts of natives. But the last thing, when we talk about like assimilation, this is a more unique thing set up by the Spanish, the encomienda system, where it's trying to bring natives into Spanish culture through teaching religion, through teaching language, and really kind of breaking people into groups. Now, this is obviously very forced. It's very damaging, and as you'll see, like others like Casas will actually speak out against this. But it does bleed into some kind of assimilation as far as mestizos, people actually forming unions and creating kind of this more fractured, no, I mean not fractured, but segmented society. But all this is really just kind of table setting, because when we get to period 2, that's when we'll really start to understand those permanent settlements and how that's really going to kind of encase and settle relations moving forward. So yeah, tomorrow we'll talk about period 2.